If you want to find good ideas to write about, start by looking for things that don't make sense. But wait, how does that make sense? For an answer, let's talk about a billionaire real estate investor named Sam Zell. So one day, Zell is reading the newspaper just like any other day, when he sees that they've opened a Gucci store in Ulaanbaatar, the capital of Mongolia. And he thinks, Mongolia? Why are they opening Gucci stores in Mongolia? So he does some research, he talks to his friends, does some more research, but Zell still can't figure out why Gucci is opening up locations in Mongolia. To him, it just doesn't make sense. So what does he do? He literally gets on a jet and flies to Mongolia to see what's going on. So he lands there and quickly realizes that Mongolia is in the middle of a giant resource boom that people aren't really talking about. And that resource boom is causing increased manufacturing and spending, and also all kinds of new retail locations to open up there. You see, by trying to resolve his confusion around the Gucci store, Zell stumbled upon information that was relevant to his career in investing. Just like that, he now had an edge on the Mongolian economy, the Asian economy, and the global economy too. Just by thinking that doesn't make sense and then going out and seeking an explanation, he ended up with prescient information about where the world was going. But now I want to take a step back and talk about the point here. The point is that most people, they run away from complexity. When the world doesn't make sense, when they're confused about something, they say, you know what, too hard, I'm gonna move on to something else. I wanna stay in things that I'm comfortable with, things that I know about. But Sam Zell, and it's the same thing with great writers, they move towards things that don't make sense. They understand that what seems like confusion is actually an opportunity, an invitation to explore and to learn more about the world. And I first heard about this idea in 2016. You see, I was in the second deck at the 92nd Street Y in New York City, and I was watching a live interview between Tim Ferriss and Adam Robinson. So Adam Robinson, he's the guest, he's on stage, and I'm listening, and I'm like, this guy is brilliant. He's talking, and he says, and I quote, "One of the key things in investing is to be aware when you hear a voice in your head that says that doesn't make sense. Because that's where the gold mine is, things that don't make sense."
So things that don't make sense. Let's think about the logic of it. And by the way, we don't always use that word. In other words, it's sometimes self-talk, and sometimes we may even hear a Fed chair saying, it just doesn't make any sense why interest rates keep going lower, right? And really, what that person means, or what you yourself mean, but you don't articulate, is that what I'm seeing in the world is at odds with the mental model I have of the world. That makes no sense.
And what I've learned from that idea is that people like Zell and Robinson, and great writers too, what they understand is that all of us have a worldview, a working model for how the world is, or at least how the way it's supposed to function. And we find comfort when we do things in accordance with our worldview. You know, people say all the time, I want to question my worldview. But if you really observe how people act, it's just not true at all. And that's fine. Most people want comfort, stability, a friction-free life. But it is the rare person who runs towards confusion, who embraces it. And by looking for things that don't make sense, they stumble upon new ideas. Because when we find something that doesn't make sense, what's really happening there is that we're identifying a discrepancy between the way that we thought the world worked and the way it actually does. It's kind of like the famous coffee cup example that Sam Harris brings up all the time. He says that he always has a cup of coffee next to him when he writes, and he doesn't really think twice about picking it up. But that's because subconsciously, there's a whole laundry list of predictions going on in his head based on his worldview or his working model of the world that allow him to basically be in the flow and then pick up that coffee cup and take a sip without thinking too much about it, right? And all this is shown by the fact that if you were to reach for that cup of coffee and discover that the handle all of a sudden is squishy or something like a sponge, you would suddenly think, what? That's weird. That doesn't make sense. And the key here is that whether we're talking about squishy coffee cups or Gucci stores in Mongolia, more often than not, we only become aware of our worldview once our predictions, once our assumptions are violated. And to be a good writer, you gotta pay attention to these moments of fleeting awareness. when you get to a place where you're reading something, you're listening to somebody talk, and you hear something and you go, that doesn't make sense. Or when something that used to not make sense all of a sudden clicks for you, that's when you run to the page. I call this the magic moment, because inspiration is perishable. And there's this very small amount of time, and I think that this is where so much good writing happens, where you still remember what it was like to not know something, but now you know it now. And that's when you get that rush of epiphany, when your wild intuition, your excitement can actually overpower your scared and judgmental prefrontal cortex. That's when you go right. And what I've learned is that the world always makes sense. So when something doesn't make sense, what really doesn't make sense is your worldview.
But no, whenever something's weird, again, your mental model of the world is incorrect. And you can either adjust the model, in which case you're likely to discover a gold mine. You are now privy to things you would not have seen before. Or if you saw, you would have just said, oh, that's ridiculous.
And that's exactly the orientation that we want to have when we're writing ideas. We are trying to embrace things that don't make sense. And if you've recently encountered something that didn't make sense to you, drop it in the comments below. I'd love to see what new and wonky ideas you're all coming across. But then how do we actually use this idea, this philosophy in our writing? Well, when you do end up finding these secrets through reading, through conversation, through videos like this one, these hidden chambers of ideas that other people are ignoring, well, hold on to them. And know that knowledge is social, so you can trust that the things that don't make sense to you will likely not make sense to other people too.
The world is dangerous because we don't know what's going on. Being able to navigate things that don't make sense is crucial, right? It's a huge edge if you can navigate things that don't make sense.
But unlike Zell, you don't need to fly across the world in a private jet to start looking for things that don't make sense. All you gotta do is open your laptop or your phone and start reading on the internet. You're already there. And pay attention to what resonates with you, what makes you scratch your head. Look for ideas that other people are running away from because they don't make sense, and say, wait, you know what? I'm gonna go learn about that. I'm gonna go investigate that idea, understand it better. And then of course, write it down. Because once you start writing, you're taking on the challenge of sense making. Writing is going to force you to structure that idea, to clarify it for yourself. And as you clarify it for yourself, if you can share that idea with others and they're surprised about it too, then boom, you know exactly what you should be writing about. Those things that don't make sense. And if you want to improve your process of writing online, check out my video on Morgan Housel's Guide to Writing.